Thank you very much, Rick, and thanks everyone for having me and for being here today. I found it really interesting just learning about the history of the AIC and how long it's been around and that kind of thing. So my colleagues, Anthony and Sam, did a fantastic job of sort of summarising a whole lot of research that they've done into a very small space of time, and I'm terrible at doing that. So I'm going to just give you a bit of an insight into just two studies in this area, which are fairly relevant to one another. So I'm talking about child sexual abuse material offending, and I use that term as opposed to the previous term child pornography, because it really sort of represents what it really is. It's a severe abuse of a child. And thankfully the legislation is actually catching up to this sort of terminology, in Australia at least, using the term child abuse material or child sexual abuse material. So why is it important to study perpetrators of online sexual abuse of children? Well, there's a few really good reasons. Firstly, the main reason is that online sexual exploitation of children, in addition to the contact sexual offending, is found to have some really devastating impacts that are very unique to the contact offending. So this includes things like being re-traumatised at the thought of someone constantly viewing their abuse online and really having to deal with that constant triggering effect when a police officer or someone else notifies them that someone's actually viewed their abuse. Survivors, and this is some of the authors and researchers that have done work in this area, and they found that survivors are terrified of being recognised on the street by someone that might have viewed their material online, and that some survivors actually are recognised on the street, and actually because there's a lot of material, abusive material on the dark net, and the offenders often use the survivors' real names when they upload an abusive video. A lot of offenders know their names and they find out who they are when they're adults, and they Google them and they post pictures of them as adults on the darknet. So there's a realistic anxiety that goes with being a survivor of online sexual exploitation of children. Another good reason is that the number of CSAM, and I use the acronym CSAM to say child sexual abuse material, the number of CSAM reports to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children is increasing rapidly with every year. You can see here that in 2014 there were 1.1 million reports to the NCMEC by electronic service providers like Meta and Google. And in 2022 that reached over 31 million. And if you can imagine that every CSAM report that Meta or Google or Snapchat provides to the NCMEC can contain tens or hundreds or even thousands of images of children being sexually abused, it's almost sort of unfathomable how much is really out there. So that's another good reason why we need to sort of look at this behaviour more and more. Another good reason is that research suggests that a large proportion of CSAM offending or online offending remains undetected. There's some robust research showing that a lot of these offenders don't actually get caught. And so what we're looking at in the criminal justice figures, and which is what a lot of research is based on, is really only the tip of the iceberg. So we know very little about CSAM offending in the community. So if we need to understand this behaviour, we need to look at the undetected offenders in the community to understand how the offending operates. So I was particularly interested in this question of how people begin viewing child sexual abuse material, given it's sort of increased dramatically over the last 20 years with the internet and with online platforms and smartphones making it easier for this offence to occur. I wanted to know how people actually first make that decision to view child sexual abuse material. So I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about my PhD study, and these are my wonderful co-authors, Professor Rita Shackle and Professor Judy Cashmore, my supervisors, and my colleague Dr. Michael Cito, who helped me with this study. I did a study on 5 different countries recruiting people anonymously. I used Reddit because Reddit generally doesn't have a lot of identifying information in people's platforms. People don't generally use their real names and their real photos and that kind of thing. So this was, it was hoped that this would encourage people to be more honest and be happy about reporting illegal behaviour. I didn't collect any identifying information from people, so I guarantee their anonymity. I always have trouble with that word. I literally couldn't match the responses to the IP addresses with the platform I used through Redcat. So around 5,500 respondents completed the survey, and of these, 742 said that they had viewed CSAM, and noting that this is not a representative survey because I had to target a hard-to-reach population. And of those who said that they had viewed child sexual abuse material, 70% were male, 20% were female, and 4% identified as another gender. And even just looking at those stats is a lot different to what we see in the criminal justice figures, where less than 3% of people who view this material are female. So another important reason to look at community samples. So we asked how old people were when they first viewed child sexual abuse material, of which 70% said that they were under 18 when they first viewed this material. This was actually a surprise to me. I know that more and more adolescents are viewing adult pornography and other harmful forms of material, but when I first saw this about 3 years ago, I thought there might be something wrong with the data because I didn't really consider that kids were actually viewing this kind of material online. So the most common age of first exposure to CSAM was 14 to 15 years, followed by 10 to 13 years, and 16 to 17 years. So I won't bore you with the stats too much. I know you're supposed to explain the analysis in great detail, but there's not a lot of time to do that. So just quickly, I used a Cox regression that allowed me to look at the association between the age of first exposure to CSAM and the current age at the time of the survey. And that showed me that the age of CSAM exposure is decreasing, so the younger cohorts tended to look at CSAM at younger ages. And that's probably not surprising given what I said before about younger people being exposed to adult pornography at increasingly younger ages. But this evidence is really important to have so that we can look at things to do about this to prevent exposure. We asked people how they first came across the material, and the most common response was that they were searching for adult pornography online. It makes sense. Kids are really curious and they will search for pornography, and then they'll go down rabbit holes, they'll click on thumbnails, little videos that will pop up, that kind of thing, and they find themselves looking at abusive material. Interestingly, you'll see that very small proportions actually searched the normal web, so just around 10% searched the normal web intentionally, and only around 2.8% searched the dark web. So most of this is first being encountered on the clear net. So basically, around 86% first discovered CSAM by accident, or they had someone show or send it to them. I also asked people, once they had viewed this material, because as I showed there, a lot of people first viewed it by accident. I asked people, once you'd viewed it, did you actually intentionally view it again after that? And 45% of people who discovered CSAM by accident went on to intentionally view it again. So we can see now that accidental exposure is a huge risk factor for subsequent intentional viewing. I did also do some logistic regressions to look at, among the adult survey respondents, who was more likely to view CSAM. There were around 13 variables. I won't go into all of them, but the ones that stood out were viewing bestiality pornography featuring adults, there were around people who had viewed bestiality pornography were around 6 times more likely to have viewed CSAM. So those two forms of material viewing go really hand in hand. Also, visiting chat forums where people discuss adult-child sexual relations. Now, there are a lot of chat forums like this on the darknet that I've looked at, where people openly talk about their attractions to children and share CSAM, that kind of thing. But there are also a lot of chat forums on the ClearNet where people can actually legally talk about their attraction to children as long as they don't go into their offending. And I've seen these chat forums where people tend to get around the legality of it by using a lot of hypotheticals. Hypothetically, if I did this to a child, what would you think, and that kind of thing. We can see here that these chat forums are really unhealthy, and you're much more likely to be viewing CSAM if you are on these chat forums. So, like I said, I was really surprised by the early age of exposure to CSAM. But then another organisation, Protect Children in Finland, came up with a study that also surveyed CSAM viewers, but they surveyed them on the darknet. So slightly different methodology, but they came out with exactly the same stat that I had, that 70% of respondents first viewed this material at under 18. So we've got 2 studies now, one on the ClearNet and one on the darknet, saying the same thing. The Protect Children study in Finland also found that 50% of adult CSAM viewers said that they did want to stop, but they didn't know how. And this is really relevant to the second study that I'm going to talk about in a minute. The implications of this study, going back to my study, is that we just don't know the impact that viewing CSAM will have on young people. There just isn't a lot of research about this. Some kids might not realise that they're viewing abusive material. There's evidence from CSAM survivor surveys that survivors are told to smile for the camera when they're being abused. And for the young person's brain, they might be viewing this material of a child that's a similar age to them and think that everything's fine and that it's not abusive. Viewing the material could also normalise the sexual abuse of children, which could lead to young people becoming more likely to be victims or perpetrators of child sexual abuse. There's no evidence to suggest this yet, but this is just some of the possibilities with what they're viewing. So there's really a need for early intervention and redirection. And we need sort of more programs where adolescents can go to anonymously. A lot of kids will not want to talk about what they see online with their parents or the police. And I know that the E-Safety Commissioner is doing has a lot of resources for kids. I think we just need more education about this in schools and that kind of thing, about what material is out there and what they're really looking at. So there's a number of other things that should be done to prevent this and to prevent escalation to further offending. I won't go into too much detail, but they mainly revolve around the tech sector because, as I showed that graph earlier, most of this child sexual abuse material offending is happening on big platforms that we all use, social media platforms and that kind of thing. And so they have a really big responsibility to actually do more to protect children, using safety by design, as the E-Safety Commissioner advocates for, and scanning CSAM to remove material. And also, end-to-end encryption is a big issue because, WhatsApp, for example, has 2 billion users, but they can't actually see what's happening on their platform. So we have no idea how much exploitation is happening on WhatsApp. We can get an idea from Facebook Messenger before it goes to end-to-end encryption. We see that they're the biggest sort of provider of child sexual abuse material reports to the NECMEC. So it just shows you that end-to-end encryption, while it's great for people's privacy, unfortunately sexual offenders also love privacy, and it means that more children can be sexually abused and exploited with fairly low risk. So I'm just reiterating that point about the responsibility of tech platforms here. Now, another avenue that we can do more of, I think, is on evidence-based prevention and treatment. So like I said before, many offenders actually want to stop, but they don't know how. And this is an issue for countries like Australia where we have mandatory reporting. So if a sexual offender goes to a psychologist to try and get help, they have to report them to police. So a lot of offenders won't do that and won't get help. So I'm going to talk to you just really quickly about a study that we released earlier this year at the AIC, led by Alex Giannoni, who is here today. And I'll just list the co-authors here: Alexandra Vos, Hayley Boxall, and Dana Thompson. So this sort of feeds into that idea of offenders really needing help but unable to get it. We'd heard about all these programs popping up like Stop It Now, Project Prevention Dunkelfeld, others all around the world, but there wasn't really a lot of resources that put all the evidence together about whether they work or not. And I won't have time to go, because it's such a big report, I won't have time to go into a huge amount of detail with this, but you're welcome to look up this report on the website. What we found, which is really positive, is that awareness-raising campaigns have reached really large numbers of individuals who are offending or are at risk of offending in the community. So I gave the example of Stop It Now. They ran a deterrence campaign in the UK, and what they found is that over 193,000 people went to the website over around 6 months during that campaign period. And the campaign period is very much a deterrence message, saying you could go to jail if you view child sexual abuse material, but there is help if you want to stop. So just showing that so many people went to their website, it really shows the demand for these type of programs. And whether it's people going to get help for themselves or for someone they know, it shows that there is a real need for these programs. So a really positive finding in terms of how well they actually reach people in the community. The evidence of effectiveness is a bit less clear because there's so many different programs that we looked at. Some of them were online anonymous interventions like Stop It Now. Others were face-to-face interventions like Project Prevention Dunkelfeld in Germany. So as you can imagine, the findings were mixed, and also a range of different methodologies used as well. And the quality of evaluations was inconsistent as well. So we looked at about 34 studies, 34 evaluations of programs across several different countries. While the findings were mixed, there were promising results indicating success and best practice in reducing child sexual abuse material offending. So there is real potential in this area, and I think it's an area that needs to be looked at more. We also found that programs designed specifically for CSAM offending showed much more promise in this area for these particular types of offenders. And while that might seem obvious, if you look at most of the sex offender treatment programs across Australia that happen in prisons and in the community, they are focused on contact child sexual offenders. But CSAM offenders, when they're arrested and convicted, automatically get put into those same programs most of the time if they get a long enough sentence. And this research that we've produced shows that that isn't necessarily working for CSAM offenders. And the reason is because CSAM offenders have very different characteristics to contact sexual offenders, and thus they have really different criminogenic needs and treatment needs and that kind of thing. So it's not a surprise that we see that the programs that are designed specifically to cater to CSAM offending are more effective for reducing CSAM offending. So future programs development can really learn from this. Sorry, I had to time myself because I'm terrible at keeping time. Nearly done. So we also found that, back to my earlier study that I talked about the exposure to CSAM, there were really few programs designed to prevent CSAM offending among adolescents. And so, as you can see from my research and the Finnish study by Protect Children, there is a real need for more programs in this area that really cater to young people to deter them from this type of offending before it escalates. And just broadly speaking, apart from offender prevention and treatment, we need to come up with more innovative solutions to reduce this. And this will require multi-sector collaboration, because at the moment police are doing a fantastic job rescuing children and identifying offenders, but police themselves admit that it's really beyond their resource capability to really handle this problem on their own. I showed you the stats about the number of reports at the beginning. So we need to have other sectors involved in this, especially the tech sector. But the tech sector needs to work with law enforcement and policy and NGOs to actually know how to do it properly. So basically a multifaceted approach. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.